Now let's play. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second because that was a very sensitive case, and when I have discussions about what happened with Mike Brown with people, you have a group of individuals who say the cop was wrong. He didn't have to shoot him. He had to kill him. But then you also have another group of people who are defending the cop, basically saying that he was fighting the police officer. And technically, if you put, once you're fighting the police, they can look at that as assault. And, pretty much police, they're going to shoot. How does that weigh into what happened with Mike? And even though he was still fighting with the police officer, what could the officer have done to avoid a fatality in that instance?
Okay, first of all, we have to be careful when we assume facts in this case because there were two men involved in this incident. One of them is dead, and one of them was facing criminal charges. So we can't just assume that everything that Officer Wilson said is true. It needs to be tested. My argument is with the system, the biases of the system that bent over backwards to protect Darren Wilson. I'm not ready to convict Darren Wilson, but what I am ready to say is the system protected him. And by that I mean that when he testified in front of the grand jury, and I've read his testimony multiple times, he was not cross-examined. He was not asked any difficult questions. You talk about the two sides in this case, and there are two sides, but I would think there would be one thing that we could all agree on, and that is when a police officer shoots an unarmed person, they should have to answer tough questions about that. And there should be an unbiased investigation into what happened because the family deserves to know the truth and the community deserves to know the truth. Instead, what we had was Prosecutor Bob McCullough refused to recuse himself, even though 70,000 people signed a petition saying they didn't trust him with the case. Why? Because in the past, he had given pro-police statements in this case. He had never put a police officer in jail for shooting a civilian. And in the past, in another case in 2001 where two white police officers shot and killed two black men in a car who were unarmed, he called the victims bums publicly. And he never apologized for that. He has many connections with the police. And so he was not the right person to be handling this case, but he clung tenaciously to it, and he was in charge. Inside the grand jury room, he started the proceeding by telling the grand jurors, this case is different, obviously. Why is that obvious? Because it's a police officer on trial? The two assistant female prosecutors who handled the case in the grand jury repeated that throughout. This case is different. They mistakenly called what happened a crime at one point, and they backtracked and said, oh, it's not a crime. It's just a situation. They had to stop themselves from using the language that they typically use in any other case. So inside the grand jury room, Darren Wilson was really given a pass. He was not confronted with some really important inconsistencies in his story. For example, he told his sergeant right after the shooting he didn't know anything about the robbery in the convenience store, and that sergeant testified under oath right before Darren Wilson in the grand jury. Darren Wilson did not know anything about that robbery, nothing. Darren Wilson then came in and said, oh yeah, I knew about the robbery. I heard it over the police scanner, and that was in my mind when I stopped them. He was not asked any tough questions about that. He testified that Mike Brown punched him, quote, full force, hard in the face, twice. Mike Brown was a big guy, right? He would have been a heavyweight if he was a fighter. And yet when you look at the photos of Darren Wilson afterwards, you don't see any injuries. How could Mike Brown have punched him hard in the face twice with no injuries? So
how can we prove what really happened? I mean, because you have, like you said, there's multiple, there's witnesses. Some eyewitnesses actually retracted their statements. Mm-hmm. So will you ever get the truth? Because if there's not a surveillance camera nearby that can show what happened, how will we ever get down to the bottom of what really happened?
Witnesses retract in every case, especially high-profile cases. There are inconsistencies among witnesses in every case. In this case, the shooting was in broad daylight in a neighborhood where a lot of people were watching. That's not unusual. That doesn't mean we don't have probable cause to indict. Probable cause is the lowest standard in our legal system. Probable cause basically means we have one or two witnesses that say that you committed a crime, you're now charged with an arrest, and now we'll go to trial, and we'll put everybody on, and we'll get to the truth.
So similar to what Suge Knight is going through right now. Basically, he had two, that's probable cause. So it's some of the same thing.
Yeah, and exactly. And, listen, we can't ignore the racial issues here. If it's a black man and one or two witnesses say he did something wrong, you can believe he's going to be arrested. He's going to face trial, right? If it's a police officer, all of a sudden we have this very high standard we create where he can't even be arrested unless all of the witnesses are 100% consistent, which never happens in the criminal law, right? This is why we have trials. And yes, some witnesses start out strong and then they're not so good, right? And vice versa. But I will tell you that the network PBS, which is not known for being sort of a wild-eyed radical outlet, PBS, they did a very comprehensive analysis of all of the eyewitness testimony at the grand jury. There's an elaborate chart on their website. And they concluded that the majority of eyewitnesses said Mike Brown's hands were up at the time that he was shot, and the majority said that he was shot at while he was running away. Both of those are crimes. There should have been a trial in this case to get to the truth. Instead, what we had was a prosecutor telling a grand jury that they had to protect Darren Wilson, and that's what they did.